something. Do you have a scripture, any translation in front of you or your computer? Would you look up Galatians 3, the first verse? Is that the KJV?
It's the ESV.
Oh, good. Actually, I think this is going to better translate what I'm driving at here. And this isn't to make a big point, but it's just to give you a new insight as somebody that is familiar with the shroud and knows the reality of its existence. Let's go to Galatians 3, the first verse. And while she's getting there, the context of that verse is Paul is writing to the Galatians, which is a congregation he already spoke to about 600 miles north of Jerusalem. There's a reason that distance will matter in a second. And he's already spoken to them, and now he's writing them a letter, which isn't nice. He's in the first part of Galatians 3:1, he's going to bang them upside the head and call them bewitched, which in their terms is almost like calling them evil. Like it'd be like we wrote a letter and said, "You idiots, you didn't get what I said." And it's the second part of the verse I want to hone in on. And what I'm going to share with you didn't come from me. This is part of my shroud research and from Greek scholars that read the Greek, the original autograph in Greek. And it's an interesting way to view this verse that you'll have never seen before. But again, I'm not telling them that they have to believe the way I'm explaining it, but I think you'll see the truth in it. Anyway, Galatians 3, first verse, just one verse, whenever you're ready, sure.
Okay. O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? It was before your eyes that Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified.
Okay, now the first part we just heard, he banged them upside the head, but let's focus on that second part. Before whose eyes Christ's crucifixion was clearly portrayed, right? Now that word portrayed in the Greek is photographia.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think our root word is from that?
Photographs.
Photograph.
Okay.
Now, what Paul did not say to them, because he was a smart guy, he was a physician, I believe, he did not say before whose eyes Christ was crucified. He's not telling them you were there and saw the crucifixion, and that would be extremely unlikely because of the distances. Maybe one or two of them could have been, but not the whole congregation. And he is writing what he meant. He said, before whose eyes I showed you Christ's crucifixion picture. Now, we as shroud scholars have very strong evidence, Shar, that Paul was the disciple entrusted with the shroud to carry it, show it where it was appropriate. But on the other hand, he knew, these people were very smart, that artifact was a bullseye on his back. For the Romans, people that didn't want his message spread, didn't want that artifact out there, they would have creamed him. So he didn't write letters that said, before whose eyes I showed you the burial cloth of Christ. If that letter ever got intercepted, he'd be hunted. So, but you look at that verse, how else can you infer that? And that Paul was showing them Christ's crucifixion portrayed, picture of it. And Now, what's interesting, Shar, as an aside, is that if you look at study Bibles, I don't have one, but I've had a number of brothers read them to me. What happens on a study Bible down below is theologians, they're very well trained in Scripture, Hebrew, Greek, and they will explain as best they can what the verses say down below. But the interesting thing is theologians that go to theology school, by and large, do not study the shroud. They may know of its existence, but that's not part of their training. Anything about Paul had it. They don't know that. It's just not on the table for them. So what's interesting to me, Shar, is often when you'll read study Bibles, I've had them read back to me, they'll say at that verse down below, they'll say, this is a very confusing verse, and it is to them. They'll say, we think Paul was saying to the Galatians when he said portrayed that he was giving them a vivid mental image from his mind, a recollection of what he saw that day. And again, I'm not here to say that can't be right, but to me, that's a stretch. That's just, and they really don't have anywhere else to go. That's why it's confusing to them, where I would suggest that if you recognize the veracity of the shroud and that Paul had it and he was using it as a adjunct to his verbal and scriptural message to show them that, hey, look here, I took this cloth out of the tomb. It's got his image burned on it. What more, how many people do we hear, Shaw, even on TikTok, Shaw, that say, show me evidence. I want to, like doubting Thomas in the room. They probably represent the majority of humanity. I mean, blessed are those who believe without seeing, but clearly that implies there's a boatload of us that do want to see. And so for Paul to use that in that way for those doubting Thomases, shall we say, was perfectly logical. And I would just point to Galatians 3:1 as a very clear reference in Scripture to how he was using it. And once you see it that way, it almost seems plain to see it that way. Any other way is almost a stretch. I did have some Greek scholars that said, well, photographia can also mean writing. It can. It's got two ways. You can go to a picture or a writing. But again, if you read that version and try to put in a written, before whose eyes I show you Christ's crucifixion clearly written down, it just doesn't make sense to use it in that sense. I think he said what he meant, and he meant what he said. So anyway, again, small thing, not a big deal. But as you go forward in life, reading that Galatians 3:1, I think you'll have a better understanding of how Paul was using that and what he was saying there as a Shroud scholar.